how do you define historiography? What is that?
Well, I think historiography is, the technical definition is it's the history of history. It's about how historical narratives have been written in the past, how they've changed over time, and how we engage with them. I think historiography is often invisible to most people who aren't professional historians, because I think a lot of people have a misconception that history is sort of set, that it's like mowing a lawn that never grows, basically. Like you go over a patch of the past and you figure out what the facts are that happened, and then once you've mowed that patch of lawn, it's done forever. And I think people don't realize that history is a process of debate, really. And um, I find this with my middle school students particularly. They're often kind of amazed that historians don't know. There's no specific answer to something like, what caused the Crusades? What were the Crusades about? And of course, that's a topic that's been very hotly debated in historiography for the last, several hundred years, really. So I think historiography is kind of the process of how we tell stories about the past, what we're trying to get at, why we choose to look at certain subjects or investigate them or try to figure out the explanations behind them. So it can be a contentious process. It can be somewhat boring. I was always bored by my historiography courses in both undergrad and graduate school, but it is interesting when you find it about a topic that you like and see how it's changed. So there's some good things about it.
So, historiography is traditionally kind of known as the history of history, but more so it's the study of how historians have written their history, how things have changed over time, what methods they used, if I'm understanding that correctly.
Right. And I think a lot of historiography, again, people don't realize that they're engaging in it. Right now, the whole moral panic about, critical race theory, which is largely ginned up for political reasons, is a form of historiography. It's talking about, what do we emphasize in American history? What is not appropriate to emphasize? Is history slanted or that sort of thing? Those are all they usually are historiography type debates that people who wouldn't consider themselves historians or doing historiography often engage in. So it kind of comes up in a lot of contexts that people don't expect it to come up in.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, critical race theory is very prominent in historical discussions today on what types of lenses are we going to use to look at the past. And so, yeah, historiography, that's a good way of looking at it, is how are we going to look at the past? What types of ideas are we going to use? So what influences are there on how we're going to write about this? So, yeah, it is interesting. What sort of methods do we have to look into the past? How do you define historical method?
I think there's so many of them that are valid. The traditional method, the one that you get in, graduate school, is you go into the documentary history and you look up what the facts were and what the evidence is, and heavy use of primary sources from the time that you're talking about, from people who were there. But I think there's a lot of good historical methods as well that go beyond that. There's, I gave the example of the guy who plays the Middle Eastern music, and seeing what kinds of musical traditions there are, listening to stories. That's been a huge part of American history. It's been kind of under the surface for the last several decades. There's been numerous projects, many sponsored by the federal government, of oral history projects, of getting interviews with, like, there was a big project of people who lived through the Depression, and there's a World War II veterans oral project. I was involved in one of those a couple of years ago. Much earlier, when there were people still alive who were still alive at the time of slavery, there was a concerted effort to record the stories of people who had been slaves or whose parents had been slaves. So those are all good historical methods. I think intellectually, again, kind of the hallmark of historical method is a responsible approach. You have to go in understanding that the facts you may find might surprise you, or they might indicate something happened totally different than you think it did, or the causes behind it might be different, and you have to engage with those honestly. And I think there's a certain logic and rational process to it as well, which is what separates true history from pseudo history, where you have to really understand the logic behind certain things and how evidence works, and what are logical conclusions to reach, or logical ways of thinking about something that happened in the past, and not be constrained by a particular bias or a particular desire to reach a certain conclusion. So I think all of that is sort of mixed together in historical method.
Thanks for sharing. My next question was going to be about pseudo-history and how do you define that, but it sounds like you kind of covered that already. You just said, basically, from what I heard, is that pseudo-history is a misuse of historical method. It's a dishonest engagement. I owe the Ctruth patrons a huge thanks for their continued support in my endeavor to explore and map the world of chronology. Thank you all. And check out these other videos while you're here.